Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot, and on this video I want to talk to you about the difference between flying manually with the auto thrust on or auto thrust off. Now, I've chosen the Cibo 737 for this one for the simple fact that flight modeling in X-Plane is a lot better than it is in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and therefore you can see the effects to a somewhat greater extent. Now, in order to understand why we might want to use auto thrust or not, there is two things that we want to consider. The first one is the workload of the pilot. So obviously, taking the auto thrust on during manual flight means that the speed is a little bit less of a concern, even though it still is one, to the pilots. Now, compared to that, when we have the auto thrust on, especially in our simulator where we might need a hand to look around and be able to look outside the cockpit, we still have that little bit of extra workload added in the sim compared to real life when you're flying without the without the auto thrust. However, let's talk about the reasons that actually make a difference in real life as well. So, most importantly, I've chosen the Boeing 737 for this one instead of the Airbus, but I'm going to talk about that in a few moments as well. So, on the Airbus we can do both, auto thrust on and auto thrust off, while on the 737 we were not permitted to fly with auto thrust on when the autopilot was disengaged. Now, the prime reason for that on the 737 was the simple fact that the auto thrust would constantly adjust the thrust in order to maintain the airspeed, and that would cause pitch oscillations. Why is that? Well, quite simple. If you look at the plane from the outside, then you will notice that the engines are located below the center of gravity of the airplane. Therefore, as thrust is increased, your nose wants to pitch up, and as thrust is decreased, your nose wants to pitch down. And this effect in the 737 is going to have quite a huge impact, taking into account that the airplane does not have a fly-by-wire flight controls. However, even in Airbus aircraft, which do have fly-by-wire flight controls, it is still a problem. And the reason why that is because it still creates sensory illusion when the Airbus auto thrust adds a lot of thrust, and that does happen every now and then. So it tends to go a little bit under the target speed and then add a huge amount of thrust to get back as it senses that it's getting too slow. And that certainly is going to feel like you are climbing, and you might want to correct for that. Actually, what can happen as well is that the Airbus auto thrust would not actually destabilize the airplane, but the constant adding and removing of thrust has an impact on your vertical flight profile as well. Keep in mind, once again, the plane has a positive pitch on final, so the engines not only create a forward amount of thrust, but also a little of a vertical amount, since they are slightly pointing downwards. That changes your vertical speed, and therefore that changes your rate of descent of the aircraft, which can destabilize your approach as well. However, that is something that you simply need to learn how to fly with, and that is exactly what you do in the Airbus type rating. Now let's have a look at a couple of practical examples of flying manually with auto thrust. I'm taking the autopilot off over here, and we are not going to look exclusively at the primary flight display here, but we will also look at the outside, because looking outside is sometimes just giving you a little bit better of a sensation of what's exactly happening. So, right now, we are pretty much trimmed out, as you can see. However, look at what auto thrust is doing. Because we are never flying the airplane perfectly, there will inevitably be changes in thrust as we fly around. And here is what we get. From a perfectly trimmed out state, the airplane now starts climbing or descending, which I now have to counter with my control column by pulling the nose back up again. In turn, auto thrust is going to add more thrust, therefore raising my nose even further, and that is just going to cause issues over the time. Okay, so how would we correctly counter that then? Well, the answer is quite simple. In the 737, my former operator has simply not allowed use of auto thrust while you've been flying manually. Now, this actually becomes quite obvious here. As you can see now that the gusts have increased our speed slightly, auto thrust has taken the right off quite significantly, and that has quite an input on your rate of pitching of the airplane. So let's do the same thing now with auto thrust off. Okay, thank you, auto thrust. We'll just take it off, and now I'll show you why you can fly the airplane more precisely with the auto thrust off. The primary reason here is that you are going to fly the airplane somewhat with a set and forget thrust setting. So auto thrust is normally going to maintain the speed rather precisely, within like 2 or 3 knots. And in order to do that, it often needs to change the thrust rather aggressively. At least on approach it's doing that. Now in cruise the auto thrust is programmed to maintain your engines at a little bit more stable level in order to reduce the thermal load on the engines. However, on the approach it is quite aggressive, and that certainly shows and reflects in your flight dynamics. Now as you can see, if we're flying basic pitch power, then in the 737 you need roughly 5 degrees pitch, 60% N1, and as you can see, once the thing is trimmed out, like now, not touching any controls, and the thing is just flying. Might have to do some minor correction every now and then, but then again the auto thrust would have applied corrections for all of that, thereby further destabilizing the airplane. While as you can see when I'm flying manually, I don't need to do any of those. Now, in the Airbus it works pretty similar. So in the Airbus, even though fly-by-wire is going to automatically correct for such thrust changes, it does need a little bit of time to do so. Similar, for example, for deploying the flaps and countering the ballooning. The airplane does do it, but it needs a little bit of time and it needs a little bit of pilot input in order to stay on the targeted flight path as well. So when you do that, and auto thrust is active, as mentioned, due to the vertical component of your thrust, it is always going to be a little bit of a pain in that it will always cause some slight destabilization, which as you can see with my auto thrust off and the engine simply set to roughly 60% N1, I don't need to do any of that. Everything that I'm countering right now is the general turbulence that we have in the area, but as you can see I don't need to apply any trim, so the airplane simply stays in trim. Now, if we change our thrust, so let's say I'm pulling it off by like 10% now, as auto thrust might easily do, then you can immediately see how the airplane starts descending, and it will now need trim in order to get back, well, in trim. And that is exactly where the issues with auto thrust do happen. And that is, by the way, realistic, and yeah, that is what a real airplane would do. Okay, let's go flaps 1, and set our target speed down a little bit. And once again you can see when using the correct flying technique with auto thrust off, so don't change your thrust around rapidly, but you know, just let the speed come where you want it to go. And that's basically all you need to do. So we've got a localizer capture here. And then once you're back on speed, just set your thrust again. So probably a little bit more than 60% over here, like that. And that's it, all you need to do. You can see, we need a slight bit of trim in order to counter the flaps. But apart from that, the airplane is flying really very stable. And that's the big secret here. Now, let's go over a couple of airlines and a couple of examples of airlines that use or that have different policies in terms of auto thrust use. Now, we're going to start with some 737 operators. Now, in Europe, mostly the philosophy is autopilot off also means auto thrust off. In other parts of the world, like the Middle East or Africa, they normally will ask for auto thrust on. Now, the reason they will ask for auto thrust on is that the auto thrust in many cases is going to maintain the engines at a more stable N1 unless you're inside approach. So when you're in approach it is rather aggressive, but as long as you're not in approach, auto thrust is usually quite a stable system and is usually going to provide you with a little bit more, let's call it engine life prolonging envelope. That's mostly in a cruise flight though. Now, on the approach itself, auto thrust obviously offers a protection against minimum speed, but on the other hand side it also comes with the trouble that you constantly need to counter the auto thrust inputs. So you can see it is somewhat a twofold mechanism here, and finding the one that works for you basically comes down to the training that you do. So In terms of training, well, quite easy actually, with an airline that is going to encourage either side of the operation, pilots will be trained for both. Now, talking about training for both, let's go ahead and move to the philosophy of my present airline, and they actually have a rather different philosophy, because obviously it is a different aircraft. My present airline flies the 320 and the 330, and on both of these, since both are Airbus fly-by-wire driven aircraft, on both of these the philosophy is to be able to do both. So we practice for both in the simulators, and we also practice both when flying the line, and then pilots can decide on their own if they want to use auto thrust or not when they're flying manually. Now, experience is showing that around about 70% of the pilots in my airline prefer manual thrust over auto thrust, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So let's first of all start with the aircraft handling. As I mentioned earlier, even though the Airbus does officially correct for any kind of thrust change, we still need to take into account that the Airbus isn't correcting like immediately, and that due to the vertical component in your thrust, there will also be slight changes in the vertical speed as your thrust is changing, all of which have an influence on your approach. So auto thrust can work against you if the nose is pitching up and down a lot, because a little bit of a background as to how those auto thrusts work. Now, in the 737, auto thrust is barely reacting to the difference in indicated airspeed and target airspeed and the trend vector, and that is what the auto thrust in the 737 works on. Now in the Airbus it's different. In the Airbus it also senses the overall attitude and the overall energy state of the airplane, and when it senses that you're about to lose energy, then the Airbus is simply going to reduce or increase your thrust as needed. So it's a little bit more responsive than the Boeing auto thrust there, and that can cause it to, especially when you are changing pitch up and down, the Airbus auto thrust is going to provide you with a lot of thrust changes as well, meaning that even though officially the aircraft is stable like that and doesn't need any countering, it is still going to need a little bit of input in order to maintain a glide slope exactly, and many pilots don't like that and therefore prefer to fly with auto thrust off, where they can simply set the thrust manually. Another argument there on the Airbus is that the auto thrust would often accept deviations below the approach before then countering them with a rather rapid increase in thrust, and that can cause quite a sensory illusion with you. As remember from basic ATPL theory, an acceleration can feel like a climb, and therefore it can easily make the pilot feel like you're climbing, while indeed it's just gaining up a couple of knots. Alright, that much about some auto thrust theory there. Finally, there are also some airlines that do allow auto thrust, or that do not allow auto thrust in manual flight when flying Airbuses. Mostly for the reasons I mentioned, some have other reasons as well, but you basically get where this is going. Alright then, so that shall be it for this little video on the auto thrust usage. Now let's enjoy this landing and see if that one's going to be a greaser or not. If it is a greaser, I want you to subscribe to the channel. If not, here we go, it is a greaser. We don't even need to continue that talk. Alright, thank you very much everyone for watching. I do hope that you all enjoyed that one. If you did, do let me know in the comments below, and I am very much looking forward to see you all again on the next one. In the meantime, don't forget to like, as it does indeed help with the YouTube algorithms. Comment to let me know what you think about this and what your preferred style of flying is, using the auto thrust or not. And finally, if you are up for more, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for watching. And finally, if you really love my videos, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link that you can find in the video description below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all again on the next one.